Well, interesting week for Justin Trudeau as he pushed some action buttons on some hot topics. Grist for the at-issue mill. Andrew is here in Toronto tonight. Chantal is in Ottawa, and so is Jennifer Ditchburn. Well, it's been a couple of months now from a lot of different places, including at times on this program, that the Prime Minister is being pushed to start some action on some big topics. In the last couple of weeks, he has done that, including the carbon tax. Smart to pick the topics that he's picked to push buttons on to start with. Andrew?
I'm not sure he had a whole lot of choice. You had events conspiring to force this issue. You've got the ratification of the Paris Accord. You've got some upcoming deadlines on pipelines. You've got the agreement on healthcare coming up for revision. So things had to start moving. As it happens, these things are all happening at more or less the same time, which actually gives him some fluidity. It allows him to make some trade-offs, to play people off against each other. And I think it's been a deft week or two. He's moved the pieces in ways I think are to his advantage.
Well, he's certainly been playing people off against each other. We'll talk about that in a second. Chantal, your thoughts overall, though?
I agree with Andrew that the calendar dictated that there would be a move to be made at some point. It can't have been a surprise to any province that this move was going to come this fall. The Prime Minister signaled months ago that he planned to put a national price on carbon. The modalities were still up in the air. In the end, there's quite a lot of flexibility built in there, and I think it was fairly deft to make an announcement that has support from Ontario, Quebec, British Columbia, the three big ones, and not outright opposition from Alberta. That's probably as good as it can get.
Jennifer?
Mm-hmm. I totally agree on the calendar, too, and I would just throw in there the next international climate change meetings in Marrakesh next month. So a really good time to do something. And also, just for politically, the Liberals know which side their bread is buttered on. They came to power partly by wiping out the NDP in a lot of ridings. So I don't think there was a downside for them to say, hey, we're doing something finally on climate change.
All right. Well, on that issue of downside, there are risks and rewards in moving on anything at any particular time. What's the risk-reward scenario on this one, Chantal?
Well, the risk of not doing anything and not being on the side of anyone is even greater than taking the risk of doing something. The reward, I think, is to allow Justin Trudeau to actually ratify the Paris Agreement on climate change without going in the room with Stephen Harper's policies. He had just announced that he would stick to the conservative targets on emissions reduction. He had just approved a massive LNG plant in British Columbia. To not make a move that distinguished his policies on climate change from the previous government was probably the biggest risk. The reward is that they have managed to use the fact that there's an NDP government in Alberta to kind of move this file forward on carbon pricing and possibly to set down a few markers that could allow them to approve a pipeline later this fall with less of a backlash.
Jennifer?
Well, I think, as I said before, the reward is that they could get some support or build on their support among sort of left-leaning Canadians and even those who just are tired of nothing happening on climate change. But there are quite a number of risks. One of them I would see is that if they don't pay enough attention to pocketbook issues, which I think is what the Conservatives are talking about now, and there's a national tension between two of their big promises, which is climate change on the one hand, and then this new reconciliation or nation-to-nation relationship with First Nations. Just look at the Site C hydroelectric dam in BC, which the federal government gave permits to. Meanwhile, there are First Nations in that area that don't agree with that project. So I think they're going to be, when you make big decisions, you end up with some of these risks or these downsides quite naturally.
Just from the optics point of view, I wonder, where you make the decision, which side you come down on, whether you're looking like somebody who's actually making decisions on important stuff, or whether you look like somebody who's kind of saying, in some cases here, it's my way or the doorway. Andrew?
Well, he's built up a great deal of credibility in the past year, a great deal of political capital. The previous government never built up much and never used it. He's built up a great deal of goodwill, first of all, and particularly has established his bona fides, at least in rhetorical terms, on the environment, on health care, on Native issues. And at some point, you know, if you want to be a consequential prime minister, you got to use that. And now is as good a time as any. In fact, probably one of the best times because all these things are happening together. The sequencing, I think, has been very good. I mean, first he announces the LNG project in BC, the ratification of that, and gets the environmentalists all mad at him for about 48 hours. But then he announces the carbon tax. And so the environmentalists are back on board, but some of the provinces are annoyed. The sum total of it is he winds up positioning himself as somebody who can't be pigeonholed as being all environment or all pipelines, and that's probably exactly where he wants to be.
It was interesting.
But there are also, there was some give here from the federal government. Allowing provinces to pick the way they're going to go about this means Ontario and Quebec continue to pursue their cap and trade experiment. We'll see where that leads. And then there's the healthcare stuff that is coming down the pipeline, where I suspect there will have to be some give.
And even if you look at some of the provinces that are notionally opposed to this, I mean, Alberta is sort of opposed, but I think if they get a pipeline, which I suspect they will, that will bring them on board. And even Saskatchewan, I saw one calculation saying that with the revenues from the carbon tax, Brad Wall could cut personal income taxes in half in his province. Is he really going to turn up that possibility?
Not to mention the whole year that they've had to talk about these things, the provinces.
Let me show you an exchange that happened in question period yesterday. And it was interesting because it was Pierre Poilievre, the Conservative, who was asking the questions. And we kind of haven't seen too much of him since his days as a Conservative cabinet minister, who was controversial at times, lots of back and forth and fighting. Roles reversed here yesterday as Justin Trudeau and Pierre Poilievre went at each other. Watch this.
Why is the Prime Minister forcing the poor to choose between heating their homes and feeding their families?
I find that a bit much coming from the party that voted against lowering taxes on the middle class by raising them on the wealthiest 1%. A party that continues to think it's better to send child benefit checks to millionaires than it is to increase those checks to the lowest income families. Mr. Speaker, the members opposite are demonstrating how completely disconnected they are from the reality of Canadians. For 10 years, Mr. Harper, I can say it, did not engage with his provincial leadership, did not work with the provinces, and indeed the lack of leadership from the federal government on the important issue of health care was alarming for provinces and for Canadians.
All right, so that happens yesterday. Does he, you know, first of all, it's sort of no more Mr. Nice Guy in the House from the Prime Minister, but has he got a point there in his attack on the Conservatives, Jennifer?
Well, I think it makes complete political sense. I mean, the Conservatives had 10 years to do something on climate change, reduce emissions, bring in some regulations. They didn't do it. Moreover, there's a leadership race right now in which one of the candidates, Michael Chong, has actually talked about carbon pricing. There's a number of Conservative voices out there and a lot of private sector voices who are talking about, okay, this is the time where Canada needs to talk about innovation, clean technology, how are we going to move ourselves forward into the future in terms of the economy. So I think the approach that he's taking seems, from a political standpoint, perfectly sensible.
Andrew?
If he was going to give the complete historical record, he would say neither the previous Liberal government nor the Conservatives in power did anything on this file. So it's been 19 years of inactivity, and he gets to claim credit for acting now, but I think it's been a bipartisan inertia on that. But that's absolutely correct that the Conservatives themselves are starting to show some divisions on this. I would say the more forward-looking ones are realizing we cannot simply stay offside on this issue. There is a distinct Conservative position that can be put forward on this, which is a revenue-neutral carbon tax and also a regulation-neutral one. You use the carbon tax to replace some of the existing failed approaches rather than simply layering it on top. That's a way forward for them. That's a distinct argument. But simply saying don't do anything or let's use the most ineffective and costly mechanisms we're dealing with, I don't think either of those are really tenable positions in the long run.
Chantal?
Let's agree that most Canadians will not see this tax between now and the next election. This is not the GST. It's not going to be very different from what's already happening for most of them. So when the Conservatives take it to this choosing between feeding your kids or heating your home, there's actually never going to be that kind of a scenario for most Canadians, and it allows the Liberals to play up their tax breaks for families, which didn't get all that much coverage. So not a great ground of attack. Also, the Conservatives have a huge gap in their rationale. in that it is their targets. They say they support the Paris Agreement. They have put nothing forward as to what they would do if they had to actually meet those targets. So on those two scores, fairly weak. And then there's the long list of corporations, including oil companies, that have come out in support of what the government has done this week, which is pretty awkward, considering that the Conservatives are claiming that this will destroy the economy.
But Peter, you could argue that carbon tax is not a good idea and that regulations are better, or that you should regulate the auto industry. But for so many years, the Conservatives didn't even want to mention the word carbon pricing or carbon tax. They made it effectively a political taboo in Canada, which is sort of intellectually cheap, right? So finally, some people in the party are saying, well, maybe actually we should look at all of the options on the table and decide which one is the best. But you still have a constituency in the caucus and in the party that's like, no, this is a taboo, and we're going to continue using this line into the future. And it's starting to make them seem like a little bit old.
I remember Stephen Harper refusing to, he was sort of teasing the idea of maybe I'm interested in Alberta's carbon levy, remember? Right. And so I said to him, well, isn't that a tax? He said, no, it's not a tax, it's a levy. Just wouldn't go there with that word. Andrew, the point you wanted to make?
Well, just to note that I don't think Trudeau can be too brassy with the Conservatives when this is a guy who's now adopted the Conservative carbon targets as his own, having said he wouldn't, who's adopted the Conservative healthcare escalator as his own when he said he wouldn't. So, if he does too much of that, and the Conservative approach to the provinces he's more and more looking to resemble, so if he does too much of that, I think he leaves opening, at least on his left, for people to say, how different is he really? All
right, last quick point, and I want to show you a couple of clips of provincial ministers who were meeting this week and their reaction. Chantal quite correctly pointed out earlier that there's significant provincial support for Ottawa on a number of these programs, but not unanimous. And here's a sense of where the opposition is, both from Saskatchewan, in this case Saskatchewan, and Newfoundland Labrador. Watch this.
A decision that was made by the federal government, and we feel it was not made. It was a betrayal of the collaboration that was indicated all along.
To have this sort of top-down driven, this is how it's going to be approach runs counter to what we've all been talking about.
And there were tough words as well from the Quebec minister at this. Where are we at this point on federal-provincial relations? Don't we love that term? But does this indicate a turning point here on the happy days of sunny ways of a year ago? Chantal?
No, I'm not convinced, but what I am convinced is that every premier wants to draw the Prime Minister onto a discussion about health care. And he keeps sending them as health minister. As you know, the health minister does not decide the size of transfer payments or how quickly they actually increase. So that conversation at this point is taking place on terms that the provinces dislike intensely. Where that is going to go, I suspect, is probably more likely to find the provinces united than this carbon pricing discussion.
Less than a minute left, Andrew.
It's a bit like the old Soviet Union version of peaceful coexistence, where if you did anything to, disagree with them, then you weren't being peaceful and coexisting. The provinces have this version of collaboration where you just simply hand them the money when they demand it. It's their only tune. They don't really have anything to offer in exchange. They tried to establish this linkage with the carbon price things, and you saw Trudeau kind of bat that back, saying, well, you're going to get the carbon pricing whether you like it or not. I think this was an inevitable day that they would start to squabble.
Quick last word, Jennifer.
What the ministers say and then what happens behind the scenes with public servants and so on in negotiations are two different things, and it's forever been thus. They will always complain. As long as I've been on the Hill.
All right, leave it at that. Jennifer, good of you to join us. Andrew in Toronto, Chantal in Ottawa this week.